So today we're going to be hearing from some incredible panelists advancing work on adaptive reuse for affordable housing. Alyssa Augenstein is a senior architectural historian at the Public Archaeology Lab Incorporated. Bob Azar is the deputy director of the Providence Planning Department. And Lauren Canapari is a senior project director at Wing Companies. And Michelle Blue is the director of housing development here at One Neighborhood Builders. Thank you so much for joining us today. So now let's transition into some questions. Lauren, you work at Wing Companies, which has done many adaptive reuse projects for affordable housing developments, including over 40 former mills in Massachusetts. Can you talk about why Wing has focused on adaptive reuse and what tools Wing uses to bring these developments to reality?
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. And yes, as Ali said, Win has done over 40 adaptive reuses of abandoned mills, along with, schools and other reuse projects, really throughout New England. I think these projects are extremely complicated and, something that maybe not everyone is able to put together. And once we kind of, got a great team and, figured out all the complexities and difficulties of rehabbing these mills, we kind of realized, oh, we kind of figured out the secret combination, right? Which is no secret, but we have, a great team. I think one difficulty, of course, is this isn't, new construction where you build it to how it is. You have to fit your units, fit your development into the building, which is can be complicated and can be difficult. And sometimes that means, different unit sizes, 40-foot wide hallways, just different adaptations to get, these beautiful buildings back into housing. Of course, there's the historic, I guess I'd say that there's a lot of funding that goes into these. They're expensive projects, expensive and complicated. So, something that we've done is really understood all the different sources of funding for these kinds of endeavors. And of course, historic tax credits are a big part of that. Alyssa can speak obviously more to the historic portion, but federal historic credits and Massachusetts state historic credits, some local funds, CPA, Community Preservation Act funds, which are dedicated towards historic housing. A lot of the mills that we have personally redeveloped are in what are called, gateway cities, former industrial cities that have a lot of vacant mill space, like Lawrence, Lowell in Massachusetts, New Bedford. We've done a bunch of projects there. And there's incentive, the local government really wants these buildings to be rehabilitated. The state government wants them to be rehabilitated and bring life and housing to the people who really need it in these cities. So I think it's a combination of all of those things. And of course, working with local zoning boards to, help us, kind of realize the vision and push that through if it means changing from, industrial to residential zoning or making some exceptions to planning to make these projects fit. I think it takes some vision from everybody working. And I think the drive to get more affordable housing, allows people to do that. So I think that's why we've really had success.
Thank you. That's so helpful. I think what I'm hearing is just a lot of collaboration and a lot of different actors involved, from government to working with Alyssa, who's a consultant. We'll get to talk about Alyssa, but yeah, it seems like Win kind of found that secret sauce. So thank you, Lauren, for that. And so Alyssa, now I'd like to turn to you. So we often hear about the supposed tension between historic preservation and affordable housing goals. You have served as a historical consultant to many affordable housing developers, including for Win. Could you talk about the difference between historic preservation and adaptive reuse, as well as how you've seen this supposed tension play out between preservation and affordable housing?
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. There is an inherent sort of distrust, I think, with interpretations of historic preservation versus rehabilitation or adaptive reuse. Restoration preservation really focuses on maintaining your existing structure, not really making any changes. You're not really repurposing it for anything. And we do work with a lot of government reviewers that maintain that interpretation of what's called the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. So it can complicate the project and it can certainly add cost and time. But what tax credits focus on is adaptive reuse. And it's for all building types. We've been involved in public housing redevelopments, conversions of historic schools, office buildings, courthouses. It's the gamut. And qualifiers for historic credits, federal and state. In most states, your building has to be at least 50 years old. So today we're coming up on 1975, which is wild. It's crazy to think. I mean, a lot of these office buildings, which is a part of, I think, a big conversation now, are, meeting that base threshold for eligibility. You also have to be listed in the National Register of Historic Places or at least be determined eligible, and that's something that your consultant would help you do. I mentioned the Secretary standards for rehabilitation. This is sort of just a broad list of just sort of guidelines that are broadly interpreted that you just have to maintain, your historic fabric to the best of your ability. And just sort of maintain that historic sense and feeling of space. Depending on what state you work in, there are different regulations and requirements. Some states are more complicated than others, but I'd say most of the New England states are fairly easy to work in. Our state historic preservation offices are wonderful. Rhode Island is phenomenal, really communicative, willing to visit your projects and work with the team. Unfortunately, though, in Rhode Island, our state credit was eliminated in 2008. There is a residual credit that just was never captured by developers when the credit was active. So we still have this sort of pot that you can dip into and get in the queue and secure the credit if your number comes up. It's just not a guarantee. So hopefully we'll see the state credit come back to Rhode Island someday.
Thank you so much. And thanks for also for giving that history. I think that is so important. And also, I think that there's still money available for the historic tax credit, but it's kind of this legacy pot. It's really helpful to understand. And also the different rules in different states and also how that happens. So thank you for that. And also, I was very surprised to hear that 1975 would be considered historic when we think of what's historic, especially walking around in New England. I think we think of things that are much older. And so that's, I think, a good fact check on that. So thank you for that. So now I'd like to turn to Bob. Bob, you work at the planning department for the city of Providence. And I'd like to ask you about a state law that recently went into effect in Rhode Island regarding adaptive reuse. How has that affected, or do you anticipate it affecting developers using adaptive reuse for affordable housing in Providence and throughout the state?
Sure, and thanks for having me. So this is a new law that requires communities to allow for buildings that were originally built for non-residential uses to be converted to mixed use, and particularly housing. At least half of the floor area of the project has to be for housing. And this could include conversion of a commercial building, industrial, offices, schools, religious facilities, medical buildings, even malls. There are some restrictions. If there's environmental land use restrictions that would prohibit residential, the community doesn't have to allow for that conversion. But it's a big deal because often communities will create separate zoning districts and not allow for residential, say in a commercial zone. But this law will sort of bypass any such restrictions. So importantly, in a place like Providence, we think that this is an important tool because it can be used, say, in lower density residential areas where there might be a school that has been surplus by the city or by a religious institution. And so it removes an impediment to development of housing, and more particularly higher density housing that might not otherwise be allowed. As we've heard, it's also a historic preservation strategy, so it fulfills a lot of the policies that we think are important for housing production. In terms of affordable housing, it can be challenging. Adaptive reuse, as we've heard, you wouldn't necessarily choose to build a structure for housing in the same way you'd build a school or an office building. So, so it can be complicated. It can be more expensive. Using traditional affordable housing subsidies may not be enough. So you may have to turn to other sources of funding to make the projects pencil. But at least from a zoning perspective, it removes those impediments. And I think it's one of the tools that we have in the toolbox.
Thank you for explaining that, Bob, and for giving that context. I think when we had talked about this previously, you'd given this example of like a church, and then in a single family zoning neighborhood, you could have like 4 families in there and 4 households in there. So I think that, or for example, and that now this law like allows you to do that a little bit easier. So now hearing about kind of transitioning from kind of the policy to what it's looking like in practice, let's transition to Michelle. So Michelle, One Neighborhood Builders has some adaptive reuse developments in the pipeline. So could you describe these projects, the different actors involved, and how, and we've heard a little bit that it's more expensive compared to new construction and can be a little more difficult. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, thanks, Allie. So briefly, I'm going to highlight just 3 adaptive reuse projects that One Neighborhood is working on, all of which do involve some level of historic preservation as well. One is in Central Falls, involving the adaptive reuse of an old police station paired with new construction. Another is in Cumberland, involving the adaptive reuse of a church. And the third is in Providence, involving the adaptive reuse of a mill building, also paired with new construction. And what I mean by saying all involve some level of historic preservation is that the buildings are not listed on the historic registry. However, One Neighborhood, in collaboration with Rhode Island Historic Commission, as well as other state agencies, have agreed to preserve various elements of historic nature throughout the building. So this agreement and the details involving, specifically which elements we're going to be preserving and the work that will be performed is outlined in an MOU that's between One Neighborhood Builders, as well as Rhode Island Historic Commission and Rhode Island Housing. And I don't necessarily think that this is a challenge or element that differs between affordable versus market rate adaptive reuse and historic preservation, but the impacts are for sure greater for the affordable projects. And that's the level of unknowns and the potential costs that could be associated with these projects. Oftentimes it isn't until you are past the point of initial due diligence and further along in your design and permitting phases that you continue to uncover these unknowns associated with the design and construction, that exist within these buildings. And so you really need to be able to conservatively and appropriately adjust your financing and budgets accordingly. And this does become increasingly, more difficult with the limited resources for affordable housing development, right? So, not being able to rely on higher amounts of debt as a source to fill these gaps associated with, it's definitely an issue that we face.
Thank you so much for that context, Michelle. And I think, yeah, the role of the historic, we've heard a bit about the role of the Historic Commission and how that factors in and kind of different developments. And so that's like, I know in affordable housing, there's a lot of sources at play. And so I think it's adding another actor, which is just really interesting to hear about. So thank you for that. So Alyssa and Lauren, you both have worked in several states. And Alyssa, you touched on this a little bit. How have different states and municipalities incentivized or de-incentivized adaptive reuse for affordable housing? Are there regulations, requirements, or funding differences between states or municipalities that you've noticed?
I think with the basic regulations in Rhode Island, like I mentioned, it's become more difficult to ensure that your project is going to receive the state credit just because you have to get into this line. Basically, you submit a one-page form that gets you in this queue, and if your number comes up, you have to be shovel ready, I believe, within 6 months. And you just don't know when that's going to happen. If your number does come up and you are ready, you could receive a 20% credit up to $5 million. And that can be increased by 5% if your first floor space is dedicated to a trade or some kind of commercial use. In Connecticut, it's an automatic 20% state credit that can go up to 30% if you have a percentage of affordable housing included in your build out. In Massachusetts, it's a base 20% credit. However, this past summer, their $50 million state cap was more than tripled to 110 million. So we're seeing our clients get much larger allocations than I've seen in my career. A few of even the projects I work on with Wynn, you have to file in Massachusetts quarterly for your credits. It's a complicated program, but these quarterly allocations are typically between, like, say, $200,000 and $400,000 of your qualified rehab costs, and I'm seeing those allocations jump to $1 million just in the last round. So it's giving us hope that the credit in Mass is recognized as a massively important tool for the redevelopment of affordable housing in the state.
Yeah, I would say, to build on that, we all these projects I'm talking about in Massachusetts, we could not have done without the state historic tax credit. That's a vital part of our funding stack. And Allie, as you alluded to, some other things aside from the historic side, I think things like in the QAP, and Rhode Island has this as well, giving when you apply for financing through the state, giving extra points for the reuse of vacant or blighted buildings, giving, extra points for the reuse of historic, buildings that aren't being used. We see that in Massachusetts, we see that in Rhode Island. And, obviously that's very helpful and motivates us to look into these projects, because we know there's a higher chance we're going to get funding. And then I think, on a local level, some of what Bob's talking about, having support to zone these projects, zone them quickly, and then also support, occasionally for example, we've had municipalities where there's no natural gas allowed. And for some of these, we've done all electric mills, or we can do all electric, except for hot water, which we do, one gas boiler, because the buildings are so large. And sometimes we'll be able to receive, relief for that. Kind of small things like that, but all of that makes a difference on the local and state level.
Thank you so much for that. That's really helpful, I think, of all of the different pieces that go into it. And you touched on natural gas, which makes me think about efforts to advance energy efficiency and decarbonization, and moving away from fossil fuels. So I want to ask Michelle about that. So One Neighborhood Builders and many other affordable housing developers are increasingly moving away from fossil fuels and prioritizing these greener ways of building. And so how have you seen this adaptive reuse and historic preservation interact with these goals and getting these projects funded? I know this was something at Steeple and Stone, if you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and just to, one quick comment about historic tax credits. So from the affordable side, we have at One Neighborhood looked about incorporating historic tax credits, particularly in all three of the projects that I mentioned. And unfortunately, it's really hard to make the math work, because the level of additional, say, preservation to meet that, to meet the requirements of the historic tax credits, those costs associated with preserving the building in that manner, the math just doesn't seem to add up. So we are continuing to look at that and see if that can be a resource that we add to our capital stacks for these projects, but that hasn't quite been the case to date. And then regarding your question, a lot of my answer is really similar to what Lauren alluded to at the beginning. as it relates to the retrofitting that's involved with adaptive reuse, right? So particularly related to the mechanical systems, heating, cooling, et cetera, as well as exterior upgrades that need to meet, various energy codes such as windows or roof replacements. When you're working within the confines of an existing structure, particularly one with historic elements, ability for, space making and design for these measures. So, which also means you often are forfeiting the ability to implement design efficiencies, such as like repeat unit types and other stack and design measures for these units, which of course, if you are able to implement, that really saves on design and construction costs, right? And at One Neighborhood, we are committed to incorporating solar in all of our projects, right? So, but the addition to these panels on roofs may or may not be allowed given historic preservation requirements or potential load bearing concerns on the roof. So that's just one example of kind of how, our organizational energy efficiency measures sometimes have to be quote unquote adapted to adhere to adaptive reuse and or essentially elements of historic preservation. Windows is another good example. You have to replace existing windows to meet current energy codes. But when you are adaptively reusing, particularly in your example, Allie, at Steeple and Stone, there's, hundreds of different shapes and sizes of windows there. And if you are to replace those to an historic preservation standard, that means that you're essentially customizing every single window, opposed to being able to utilize a standard window in your ordering, and again, impacts the cost. So a couple examples. Yeah.
Thank you for those examples. I'm sure we could talk about examples all day. I think you gave some great ones about the solar, the roofs, the windows. I know I've heard about the trim and how expensive trim can be.
Moldings and things of that nature. And so it really has a lot to do with specialty materials that are needed to implement these elements of, particularly on the historic preservation side, but as well as adaptive reuse, excluding that preservation. And as well as specialty contractors at times, depending on what the scope of work is.
Totally, for sure. Thank you. Thank you for all those examples. So Bob, I want to kind of have a zoom out in our last question. So people who are here, participants in the audience, feel free to get your questions ready. We're going to open up for Q&A after this question. So Bob, the city's comprehensive plan, the City of Providence, which provides a vision for Providence's development for the next decade, has been going through an update. So can you talk about any tools or policies in the plan that aim to encourage or streamline adaptive reuse, and how efforts like this can advance housing access and racial equity in Providence?
Yeah, so the comprehensive plan, which has received first passage by our council, we expect that it'll be approved by the end of next week. We've been going through this process for a couple of years now. I just want to give a shout out to Tim Shea, who's in the crowd here, leading our effort on this. Housing really has been one of the center pieces of the plan. And through this plan, we're looking for every opportunity to reduce barriers to housing production. And adaptive reuse is one of many tools that we have in our toolkit. Fortunately, this law passed already. So while it is a strategy in our comprehensive plan, it's something that we've already implemented in our zoning ordinance because we have to be consistent with state law. And the law has actually, one thing about Providence that most know is that we've been ahead of the curve for decades when it comes to adaptive reuse. We've seen dozens of projects in downtown, conversions of office and retail buildings, conversions of mill buildings throughout our transitioning industrial zones. But through this new law, we were able to expand the adaptive reuse policies, particularly in residential zones. And so when it comes to the comprehensive plan, besides adaptive reuse, we have many other strategies for further reducing barriers to housing production, in particular permitting higher density housing in every residential zone in the city. And in addition, we also have strategies for directing our affordable housing dollars to projects that affirmatively further fair housing and promote equity and provenance. So really what we try to do with the comprehensive plan is to focus and align all of our policies towards housing production, breaking down barriers to housing production, and furthering fair housing throughout the city.
Thank you so much for that. So I just wanted to check before we open it up to Q&A. Does anyone else on the panel have any thoughts on how adaptive reuse for affordable housing can advance equity, especially racial equity? Anyone in the audience? I know there are some people in the audience who have experience with this too.
Hey, Ellie, this is Ben Frost at Rhode
Hi,
Island
Ben.
Housing. I'm sorry, my webcam's not working this morning. I'm
No, this is great.
not normally a shy person. So I'm relatively new to Rhode Island, 7 weeks on the job here, coming from New Hampshire housing, where I spent a couple decades in this kind of work. And to your question about affordable housing, adaptive reuse, historic preservation, and racial equity, I think it's really important to recognize that the buildings that we're paying attention to here, many of them are in disinvested neighborhoods. And this is an opportunity for us as a community of developers to reinvest in those neighborhoods, bring money back to those neighborhoods that have been neglected for so long, and in doing that, to preserve the history that we have, and from an energy efficiency standpoint, reutilizing that embodied energy in these historic structures. I'd say as I'm settling here in Rhode Island, I'm really happy to be able to live at the Foundry. It's just a 15-minute walk to the office. A great example of historic preservation, adaptive reuse. And I just think of what the developer had to have gone through in pulling this off with these windows that are 6 feet wide and 12 feet tall. They're just amazing, but really, really hard to work with. In the end, though, I think worth it.
Thanks so much, Ben.
I think to build on Ben's point, focusing on what Lauren mentioned earlier is the gateway cities, you're helping to maintain an existing population. So there's not, displacement happening, and gentrification, and, it's, I could say probably 75 to 80% of my projects are in these community types, the Lowells, the West Warwicks, the areas that are, I don't want to say forgotten, but, a lot of the older mill towns that, the populations have moved away, and they do need the investment. And that's where most of my clients are focusing their efforts.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. And I think we're also see large immigrant communities in those locations too. There's just a really high need for affordable housing. And then when we bring in, revitalizing one of these, for example, an old mill complex, getting not only housing but retail and other uses in there, that kind of can jumpstart a whole neighborhood, and kind of make that more of a center of commerce and make it safer and all of those things. It kind of helps the existing community who's already there. So we see that a lot in the as Alyssa said, in the gateway sort of cities that we tend to focus in.
Great. Thank you all so much. And so now open it for Q&A. So if you can participate in the Q&A in a variety of ways. You can put your question in the chat, You can raise your hand by going to react and then going to raise hand at the bottom of the screen. You can also just come off mute and ask your question. So those are a variety of ways. Ask it in the chat, raise your hand, or just come off mute.
Bob, Bob McMahon, did you have a question?
Yes, hi. I'm just reacting to the issue of racial equity and adaptive reuse of buildings. And it's, as Bob Azar indicated, Providence has been very fortunate to have a lot of old mills adapted to housing. And many of those are in neighborhoods that traditionally are minority neighborhoods and where disinvestment took place. But I found, for example, like in the U.S. rubber mills in Valley and the Wanscock mills in Wanscock, both of those situations provided hundreds and hundreds of new housing units, but they're mostly occupied by middle class families and single families for the most part. And they received help in terms of tax breaks, et cetera, in terms of being developed. But there were no requirements, as far as I can tell, for X number of affordable units in those units. Bob, perhaps you can correct me or indicate if in fact those two developments do have affordable units. And the other point that I make is that they do help those neighborhoods in terms of providing jobs and income from the residents who live there to support local businesses, which is great. But in terms of housing affordable families, I think there's a question there. So Bob, perhaps you can help me out there.
Yeah. Hi, Bob. Good to see you.
Hi.
Bob and I were colleagues for many years in the city of Providence. You mentioned the U.S. rubber lofts. What was the other project?
The Wanscock Mills.
Wanscock Mills. Yeah. Okay. So neither of those projects were required to have affordable units. And this gets at a question fundamentally of economics. These projects, as we've discussed, they're already very expensive, and in many cases can't be built at all without some sort of subsidy. Usually the historic tax credit is the subsidy that makes a project feasible to begin with. And then on top of it, if a developer decides to include affordable units within a project like this, it's going to require an additional subsidy. I don't know of any project in Providence that has involved adaptive reuse and affordable housing that hasn't layered many different types of subsidies, including historic tax credits and home funds and things like that to get to the affordability. And sadly, there's not enough subsidy to meet the demand for affordable housing. So it creates a challenge for us in Providence, where if we were to enact, say, an inclusionary zoning policy that required affordable housing for adaptive reuse projects or even for new construction projects, if we don't ensure that there are adequate subsidies to create the affordable units, it's very likely that we'll get less development and less housing, and it would be counterproductive in terms of production overall. So there are some projects that really do it all. They check all the boxes. Maybe not all the boxes, but you know, an example would be something like a Paragon Mills, which is an adaptive reuse of an old mill complex, and it's half of those units are affordable. It's a win-win. Doesn't bring in the kind of tax money that a market rate development would pay, but these are the costs and benefits associated with development in the city. So I think in general, we're happy when we can produce housing. We're even happier when we can produce affordable housing. And based on the available funding, there are limits to how much affordable housing can be created in the city.
And I'd build on what Bob said, because that's all very accurate to our side of development. I would also say that that's when I kind of talked about Deal's historic adaptive reuse for affordable housing being difficult. Really a huge part of that is the funding stack, right? Where do we get all the funds from? And some of these projects will have literally 10 different sources of subsidized funding. 90% of my job is applying for funding for, from different institutions, cities, states, home consortiums. Every dollar counts, and it is very difficult to get all that subsidy together to make a project work, especially now with rising construction costs.
Yeah, and I just like to add to that, as a supporter of inclusionary development policies, and having seen how they have successfully worked in markets even such as Boston, I do think that kind of on the flip side, they do provide an opportunity for joint ventures between nonprofits and affordable housing developers, as well as market rate developers. And talking about the capital stack, these potential joint ventures could help to eliminate some of the costs associated with the acquisition and/or environmental remediation that makes our affordable housing capital stacks that much more difficult to essentially balance. So just to throw that out there, that I think there could be, it provides an avenue or a more clear path towards joint venturing between the market rate side and the affordable.
Totally agree with that.
Can I just ask Michelle, maybe what would be a good example of something like that? Are you suggesting that there are things that private sector developers, for-profit developers can do, or funds that they can access that the nonprofit sector can't?
Well, for sure. And I think it goes both ways, right? I think that there's sometimes funds that the nonprofit sector has a better chance of accessing than the for-profit does. And so it creates sort of this sharing of capital amongst the two sides. In addition to that, it helps kind of promote the development of affordable housing, essentially piggybacking off of some of those market rate dollars, where market rate dollars have the opportunity for a lot wider range of outside investment, whether it be different equity sources, right? Where our main source of equity on the affordable side is the low-income housing tax credit program or other tax credit programs that we've talked about. So I think it just opens up the ability to bringing in different types of funding sources to both sides. But there are a few different avenues, and yeah, I'd love to chat more with you about this and kind of some projects that I've worked on even in other markets that have been successful. I'm sure Lauren has experience at Wynn as well in Massachusetts doing it. But I think there's a couple avenues that can be explored as it relates to the policies.
Thank you all so much for that rich discussion. And I think it just shows how this has tentacles into so many other areas, and talking about inclusionary zoning and talking about mixed use, mixed income development and cross subsidization of how you make the financing work. We have time for one more question, if anyone from the audience has one more question before we wrap up. Okay, so seeing none, we're being very prompt this morning. So as we're nearing 9:30, I want to take the opportunity to thank our panelists and for their time, insight, and expertise this morning. And I want to thank all of you who took time out of your Friday morning to join us. We hope that you enjoyed this and that you will consider joining us at a future Fresh Friday.